My name is Vivian Grace. I'm 37 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, where it rains often enough that people either grow softer or sharper. I suppose I became the second. On paper, I'm unremarkable. I work in compliance consulting for small businesses, risk assessments, regulatory audits, the kind of work most people's eyes glaze over when I describe it. I live alone in a modest townhouse with pale gray walls and too many books. I don't post much online. I don't argue loudly. I don't perform my intelligence in the room. Most people describe me the same way: calm, dependable, private. My family has always used a different word: easy. Easy to rely on, easy to overlook, easy to assume. Growing up, I was the one who kept records, remembered birthdays, filed paperwork for my parents when English confused them, edited my brother's college essays, and balanced numbers when something didn't add up. I was praised for being mature. What that often meant was I absorbed what others didn't want to handle. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel cruel at first. It feels useful. It feels like loyalty. It feels like being needed. Until one day you realize you were never being trusted. You were being used. This story isn't loud. There are no screaming matches, no broken dishes, no dramatic confrontations across dining tables. It unfolded quietly, in bank statements and tax forms, in small assumptions, in a name written where it should never have been written. My brother secretly opened a business in my name, and when I discovered it, I reported it for tax fraud, not out of revenge, not out of hatred, but there is a line between family, loyalty, and identity theft, and once that line is crossed, silence becomes participation. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened, how I missed the early signs, how I rationalized what didn't feel right, how I shifted from invisible to intentional without anyone noticing, and what it costs when you finally choose yourself in a family that benefited from your compliance. There won't be villains here, only choices and consequences. I won't pretend I was fearless. I wasn't. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. It did. But I will be honest, because sometimes the most radical thing a quiet woman can do is document everything. If you've ever been the reliable one in your family, have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped absorbing the impact? Before any paperwork was forged, before any letters arrived in the mail, before my name became something I had to reclaim. I was the stable one. In my family, stability wasn't glamorous. It wasn't celebrated with loud praise or social media posts. It was simply expected. My older brother, Daniel, was the visionary, the risk taker, the one who always had big ideas. If he started something new every 6 months, that was ambition. If he quit something abruptly, that was entrepreneurial spirit. If I stayed consistent for 15 years, that was predictable. At family gatherings in Portland, he would dominate the table with talk of opportunities. Import, export ideas, crypto investments, a coffee cart concept, then a logistics brokerage. My parents would nod, impressed by the vocabulary, even when they didn't understand the mechanics. And then someone would turn to me and ask gently, "Vivian, you're still doing the paperwork thing, right?" "The paperwork thing." I would smile. "Compliance consulting." They'd nod. Conversation would drift away. It never felt malicious. That's the part people misunderstand. Dismissal doesn't always arrive wrapped in cruelty. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in familiarity. I was the one they called when the DM-5 letter didn't make sense, when a contract needs to be read, when a tax notice looked confusing. But when money flowed in, when decisions were made, when risks were taken, I wasn't included in those rooms. Daniel used to joke that I was the human terms and conditions. Everyone scrolls past you until something goes wrong, and I laughed, because I didn't know yet that one day something would go wrong in my own name. Growing up, our dynamic had already been assigned. He was charismatic. I was careful. He negotiated. I calculated. He moved quickly. I asked questions. My parents admired his confidence. They admired my reliability. Reliability sounds like a compliment. It often is. But over time, I realized something subtle. Reliability made me safe to lean on, but not necessary to protect. When Daniel missed rent in his 20s, my parents quietly helped him. When he defaulted on a small business loan, it was chalked up to learning. When he pivoted again and again, it was resilience. When I hesitated before signing anything, I was overthinking, and so I learned to make myself smaller in conversation. Not physically, but energetically. I would listen, observe, file away details. I became skilled at being present without being centered. It's strange how invisibility can coexist with responsibility. I handled our parents' insurance renewals. I set reminders for property tax deadlines. I created shared spreadsheets that no one opened, but everyone relied on. Daniel once told me, half laughing, half serious, if you ever disappeared, our whole family admin would collapse. It was meant as praise. But I noticed something. He didn't say we would collapse without you emotionally. He said administratively. To them, I was infrastructure, and infrastructure is rarely thanked until it fails. The truth is, I didn't resent it then. Not consciously. There was comfort in being competent. There was safety in being the least chaotic person in the room. I built a career around that strength. I advised small businesses on compliance risks, what could go wrong, where exposure existed, and how to document properly. I spent my days preventing quiet disasters for other people. It never occurred to me that I would one day have to audit my own brother. Looking back now, I can see the early pattern. I was trusted with information, but not with agency. I was relied upon, but not consulted. My name carried credibility in professional spaces. In family spaces, it carried utility. And when you are perceived as useful but not formidable, people begin to assume your boundaries are flexible. That assumption is where this story truly begins. At the time, though, I was still the calm one, the organized one, the safe one. I didn't know yet that safety in the wrong hands can be mistaken for permission. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a forged signature or a suspicious withdrawal. It wasn't a certified letter stamped urgent in red ink. It was a joke. We were at my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon. Daniel had just abandoned another venture, something involving specialty gym equipment imports. He was already pivoting, already talking about a leaner, smarter structure for the next thing. My mother was refilling teacups. My father was nodding in polite confusion. Daniel turned to me and said, "You know, Viv, with your credit score, I could build an empire." Everyone laughed. I smiled, but something in my chest tightened. He continued, grinning. "Relax, I'm kidding. Mostly. That word stayed with me longer than the laughter did. It was subtle enough that if I reacted, I would look paranoid, defensive, humorless. So I did what I had always done. I stored it away, filed it in the quiet cabinet of things that don't feel right but aren't big enough to confront. A few weeks later, he asked for my social security number. He framed it casually. "I'm filling out an application for a wholesale account. They want a reference who's financially stable. It won't affect you. It's just a formality." A formality. I didn't give it to him. But I didn't call out the red flag either. I redirected. "If they need a professional reference, use my business email, not personal identifiers." He shrugged. "You're always so cautious." It wasn't said with anger. It was said with mild amusement. Like I was a character trait, not a person. Then came the mail. A thin envelope from a bank I didn't use. Addressed to me. The return address listed at a local branch in Portland. I assumed it was marketing. I almost threw it away unopened. Almost. Inside was a generic welcome letter, thanking me for opening a business checking account. I stared at it for a long time. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic gasp, just stillness. The business name printed beneath mine didn't immediately register. It was one of Daniel's ideas, a logistics brokerage concept he'd been describing over dinner a month earlier. My name appeared as the primary account holder. For a moment, I genuinely believed it was a clerical error. Maybe Daniel had accidentally used my email as a contact. Maybe someone typed the wrong social security number. My brain searched for innocent explanations because that was easier than confronting the alternative. I called Daniel. "Hey," I said evenly. "Did you open something under my name?" Silence. Just half a second. But I heard it. "Oh," he replied lightly. "That? Yeah, it's temporary. It's cleaner if it runs through you at first. My old EIN has some baggage. It's just paperwork." Just paperwork. My specialty. "It's not just paperwork," I said, still calm. "It's liability." He laughed. "You're overreacting. I'd never put you at risk." The conversation ended with reassurance instead of resolution. He promised it was temporary. He promised there would be no loans, no credit pulls, no exposure. And because I had spent a lifetime being the reasonable one, I chose the reasonable interpretation. It's hard to describe how small that first cut felt. No money was missing, no taxes were due, no debt collectors were calling. There was only discomfort, thin and almost ignorable. At dinner the following week, he spoke openly about his business. My parents beamed with pride. No one mentioned my name being on it. I watched him describe contracts, projections, and partnerships. No one asked me how I felt about it, and I didn't volunteer, because technically nothing terrible had happened yet. But something had shifted. A boundary had been tested. Lightly, casually, wrapped in confidence. And everyone around me treated it like a harmless detail. I remember washing dishes that night at my parents' sink, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I asked myself one quiet question. If I let this slide, what does it teach him about my limits? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew the cut was deeper than it looked. If the first cut was thin, the next ones were almost invisible. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as a single violation. It arrives as repetition, softened by familiarity. After that initial bank letter, more mail began appearing. Nothing alarming at first. Statements, promotional offers, a debit card I hadn't requested. Each envelope carried the same business name, the same configuration. Vivian Grace, owner. Daniel had stopped asking for permission. He had shifted into assumption. When I confronted him the second time, it was gentler than it should have been. Daniel, you need to transfer this out of my name. He exhaled as if I were asking him to pause mid-stride. I'm in the middle of closing 2 contracts. If I change it now, it complicates everything. Just give me a little time. Time. Time is the most dangerous currency in family dynamics. It feels harmless, temporary, adjustable. I gave him time. At Sunday dinners, he began referencing our structure jokingly. Vivian's technically the boss, he'd say, grinning across the table. I just do the hustling. Everyone laughed. I noticed something chilling in that laughter. It validated the arrangement. It turned the abnormal into a shared understanding. My mother once said, at least it's in the family. That's safe. Safe. I wanted to ask, safe for whom? But I didn't. Instead, I rationalized. He's not malicious. He's just disorganized. He's under pressure. He'll fix it once things stabilize. I am trained to identify risk patterns in businesses. Escalating exposure, documentation gaps, liability creep. Yet I found myself minimizing the same red flags in my own life. Because this wasn't a client. It was my brother. And loyalty has a way of distorting analysis. Then came the first tax document, a 1099 form addressed to me. Revenue reported under my social security number. Not catastrophic, not illegal on its face, just real. This wasn't theoretical anymore. Income was flowing through an identity that wasn't being consulted. I called him again. My voice was still level, still measured. You're reporting income under my name. It's easier for now, he repeated. Once the LLC is fully operational, I'll shift everything. Don't stress. You're not paying anything. I'm handling it. Handling it. I asked for documentation, profit and loss statements, expense breakdowns. He sent partial screenshots, numbers without context, totals without audit trails. If this had been a client, I would have flagged it immediately, required full transparency, issued written warnings. But at home, I softened. At home, I said, okay, just keep me updated. I told myself that pushing harder would escalate tension, that I was preserving peace. Being patient made me mature. In truth, I was participating in the erosion of my own boundary. The most unsettling part wasn't his behavior. It was how quickly everyone adjusted. My father once introduced Daniel's venture to a family friend as Vivian's registered company. He said it proudly, as if he were complimenting me. I stood there holding a glass of water, listening to a business I didn't control being attached to my reputation. No one asked if I had consented. No one wondered why I wasn't speaking, because silence, when repeated often enough, becomes endorsement. And I was still silent, not because I was weak, but because I had been conditioned to weigh emotional fallout against personal discomfort and choose the former every time. I told myself I was gathering information, that I was observing, that I was waiting for the right moment. But if I'm honest, part of me was still hoping he would correct it on his own, that he would wake up one morning and say, "This isn't fair to you." He didn't. And with every document that arrived in my mailbox, my name became less mine. Disrespect doesn't always feel aggressive. Sometimes it feels administrative. And by the time you recognize it as harm, it's already been filed. There's a moment, quiet and almost unremarkable, when you realize you're not just tolerating a pattern, you're performing a role. For me, that realization didn't come through anger. It came through observation. At a family dinner one night, Daniel was explaining cash flow projections to our parents. He used big numbers, confident gestures, and words like scalability and margin expansion. My father nodded approvingly. My mother asked how soon he thought he could hire employees. I sat there listening carefully. He referenced tax strategies I knew were inaccurate. He described deductions that didn't apply. He mentioned deferring liabilities in ways that bordered on reckless. No one looked at me for confirmation, not once, and that's when it settled over me. In this narrative, I wasn't the authority on compliance. I wasn't the name on the filings. I wasn't the legal identity tied to revenue streams. I was the quiet facilitator, the safety net, the reliable sister who would figure it out if something went wrong. They weren't malicious. That's what makes it harder to untangle. They weren't plotting against me in some dramatic, villainous way. They simply assumed I would absorb risk the way I always had, quietly. My assigned role had 3 parts. Be useful, be calm, don't disrupt. And I had played it so well for so long that stepping out of it would feel like betrayal. I started noticing subtle language shifts. Daniel would say, "Don't worry, Viv will handle compliance." My mother would say, "You're good with paperwork. This is nothing for you." My father once joked, "Every business needs someone boring to keep it legal." Boring. I realized something in that moment. My competence had been rebranded as dullness. My caution is reframed as a limitation. My restraint is interpreted as passivity. And because I didn't correct them, the image solidified. At work, small business owners hired me specifically because I saw risks they overlooked. They paid me to prevent exposure. They valued my questions. At home, my questions were seen as friction, so I stopped asking them out loud. Instead, I began asking them silently. What liabilities exist under my name? What documents have been filed? What contracts have been signed? What debts could legally attach to me? I didn't confront him yet, not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood the architecture of the situation. If I reacted emotionally, I would reinforce their perception. Vivian is overthinking. Vivian is anxious. Vivian is dramatic. If I reacted strategically, I could step out of the assigned role without announcing it. That realization didn't come with a surge of empowerment. It came with grief. Because stepping out of a family role feels like stepping out of belonging. I'd always been the stabilizer, the quiet one, the dependable one. That identity was comfortable, even if it was limiting. But now my own name was attached to something I didn't control, and the role I'd been assigned required me to tolerate it. That's when I understood something crucial. They didn't see me as incapable. They saw me as endlessly accommodating. And there's a difference. The shift inside me wasn't loud. I didn't slam doors. I didn't issue ultimatums. I simply stopped assuming that preserving family harmony was my highest responsibility. For the first time, I considered a different hierarchy. Self first, then family. Not out of selfishness, out of legality, out of identity, out of survival. That night, I went home and opened my black leather portfolio. I laid out every document I had received. Bank letters, tax forms, email exchanges. I arranged them chronologically. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was assessing, and the role they had assigned me, reliable, useful, invisible, was about to become something else entirely. Not louder, just deliberate. There wasn't a confrontation. There wasn't a discovery of catastrophic debt. There wasn't a midnight phone call from a collections agency. The shift happened on a Tuesday morning. Quiet, ordinary, almost forgettable. I was sitting at my dining table with my laptop open, reviewing a compliance audit for a client. A small construction firm that had unknowingly misclassified independent contractors. The owner had insisted it was no big deal, that it was temporary, that he would fix it next quarter. I had looked at him and said calmly, "Intent doesn't change liability." He had nodded, because when you say that sentence in a professional setting, people understand. Intent doesn't change liability. I repeated it in my head after the Zoom call ended. Intent doesn't change liability. Then I turned to the folder on my desktop labeled DG Logistics, Daniel's business. My name, my social security number, revenue flowing through it. Intent doesn't change liability. Up until that morning, I had still been holding on to a fragile narrative. He doesn't mean harm. He'll fix it. He's under pressure. It's temporary. But the law doesn't care about family dynamics. It doesn't care about birth order or childhood memories or shared holidays. It cares about documentation. I opened the latest bank statement. Deposits had increased. There were vendor payments I didn't recognize. A line item for payroll processing. Payroll. My name was the registered owner. If someone wasn't paid correctly, if taxes weren't withheld properly, if contracts were breached, it would attach to me first. My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Big news. We just signed a regional shipping contract. This thing's about to scale fast. Scale. The word didn't excite me. It tightened something inside my chest. Scaling risk under my identity. I looked around my quiet townhouse. The rain tapped lightly against the window. Everything in my space was deliberate, organized, intentional. And then there was this parallel structure operating in my name without my oversight. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not explosive, just clarity. I realized I had been waiting for him to protect me, but protection was never his role. Protection was mine. There's a particular grief that comes when you understand someone you love is comfortable benefiting from your exposure. It's not loud anger. It's not hatred. It's recognition. I closed my laptop and sat still for several minutes. I imagined two futures. In the first, I continue being patient. I remind him gently. I wait for him to transfer ownership. I absorb whatever comes. In the second, I treat this like I would treat any other unauthorized use of my identity. No emotion, just process. My heart was beating faster than usual. Not out of fear, out of inevitability. Family loyalty ends where identity theft begins. I didn't say it out loud. I felt it. For the first time, I stopped framing this as a misunderstanding. And I started framing it as a decision. Not his. Mine. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to threaten. I wasn't even going to announce my shift. I was simply going to stop participating in something that compromised my legal standing. That Tuesday morning, I did one small thing differently. Instead of texting him back congratulations, I replied, "Send me full documentation, all filings, today." No emojis, no exclamation points, no softening language. He responded with a thumbs up. He had no idea that inside me, something fundamental had recalibrated. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger implies hope that someone will change. This was something else. This was alignment. And once alignment happens, silence stops being avoidance. It becomes a strategy. After that Tuesday, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten legal action. I didn't accuse him of theft. I didn't warn my parents. I became quieter, and everyone mistook that for surrender. Daniel sent over partial documentation just like before. PDFs without complete attachments. Screenshots instead of full statements. Enough to look cooperative. Not enough to provide transparency. This time I didn't argue. I didn't chase him for missing pages. I simply created a separate folder on my hard drive labeled Unauthorized Use Evidence. Every email, every text, every bank statement, every tax form. Saved, dated, indexed. At Sunday dinner, I returned to my usual seat. I listened to Daniel talk about expansion, about hiring a subcontractor in Washington, about projected quarterly revenue. I asked fewer questions. My mother interpreted it as support. "See," she said once, smiling at him. "Your sister trusts you." Trust. I let that word hang in the air. Silence, when used intentionally, has weight. It unsettles people slowly, but only if they're paying attention. Daniel wasn't. He was thriving in the absence of friction. My quiet no longer sounded like concern. It sounded like compliance. He grew more confident. He began referencing future plans under our structure again. He joked about scaling into California. He talked about opening a line of credit if needed. That phrase caught my attention. If needed, a line of credit under my name would not be a misunderstanding. It would be an escalation. Still, I didn't confront him. Instead, I began moving in parallel. I checked my credit report weekly. I placed fraud alerts without notifying him. I reviewed IRS guidance on unauthorized filings. I consulted discreetly with a colleague about identity misuse scenarios. Hypothetically, I didn't mention my brother's name, but I listened carefully to what the law required. Intent doesn't change liability. I kept returning to that. At home, I reorganized my leather portfolio. I added tabs, banking, IRS, communications, timeline. The act of organizing soothed me, not because it solved the problem, but because it restored control. The more documentation I gathered, the less emotional I felt. Clarity replaced outrage. I began noticing something else too. Daniel stopped explaining things to me in detail. He assumed I was no longer scrutinizing. My quiet had created a false sense of security. He sent shorter updates, fewer numbers, more enthusiasm. That was the mistake. People often think confrontation is power, but sometimes the removal of resistance is more dangerous. He believed I had accepted my role again. reliable, useful, invisible. What he didn't realize was that invisibility can be strategic camouflage. I wasn't withdrawing because I felt defeated. I was withdrawing because I was observing the full scope of exposure before choosing my response. One evening, as I reviewed another quarterly statement, I noticed something that shifted the stakes again. Estimated tax payments had not been made. Revenue was increasing. Liabilities were not being offset, which meant that eventually someone would notice. And that someone, on paper, would be me. I closed the statement and leaned back in my chair. This wasn't going to resolve itself organically. Growth doesn't correct structural dishonesty, it amplifies it. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider something irreversible. Reporting it. The thought didn't feel vindictive. It felt procedural. But I wasn't ready yet. Preparation requires patience. And silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes a tool. They thought I was retreating. In reality, I was positioning. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. After I realized estimated tax payments weren't being made, I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't send a warning message. I didn't escalate. I built a timeline. In compliance work, timelines matter more than opinions. They show intent. They show a pattern. They show who knew what and when. I created a spreadsheet and listed everything chronologically. Date the business account was opened. Date I received the first bank letter. Date I objected verbally. Date income began reporting under my social security number. Dates of every request I made for documentation. Dates of incomplete responses. No emotion, just data. The more I assembled it, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't a misunderstanding that spiraled. It was a structure he continued using after I expressed concern. That distinction mattered. I also did something else he never would have imagined. I pulled official transcripts from the IRS portal under my account. When you work in compliance, you learn that assumptions are dangerous. I wanted to see exactly what had been filed under my name. There it was. Income attributed to me from an EIN I had never personally registered. Quarterly filings that carried my legal identity. No estimated payments attached. I sat very still. The evidence didn't enrage me. It steadied me. Because now this wasn't a gray area. This was exposure. At Sunday dinner, Daniel talked about possibly applying for a small business loan to accelerate momentum. My father nodded approvingly. I smiled politely and passed the salad. Inside, I calculated potential liability ratios. If a loan application listed me as the owner and defaulted, it would follow my credit. If payroll taxes remained unpaid, penalties could compound. If a client sued for breach of contract, my personal assets could be targeted. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was a structural risk. And here's what they never noticed. I stopped sharing personal details. I stopped discussing my own finances. I stopped volunteering to help with unrelated paperwork. My availability narrowed quietly. When Daniel texted, "Quick question about expense categorization," I responded, "Consult your CPA." He didn't have one. That wasn't my problem. He interpreted my reduced involvement as busyness, career focus, maybe mild annoyance. He didn't see the deeper shift. I was separating my professional authority from his operational decisions. And then I consulted an attorney. Not dramatically, not urgently. I scheduled a quiet meeting under the guise of updating my estate planning documents. In that office, I explained everything, calmly, factually. The attorney listened and then said something simple. "You have already expressed objection. Continuing to allow this can be interpreted as consent. If you want to protect yourself, you need to create formal distance." Formal distance. That phrase echoed. Up until then, my resistance had been verbal and emotional. Formal distance required documentation, certified letters, written objections, official notices, not shouting, not arguing. Paper. I went home and drafted a letter to Daniel, clear, concise, non-accusatory. It stated that I had not authorized the use of my identity for business operations, that I required immediate transfer or dissolution, and that I expected written confirmation. I didn't send it yet. Preparation isn't impulsive. I reviewed every document again, checked my credit report again, confirmed that no lines of credit had been opened. Everything was still contained, but only because I was moving before it expanded further. The strangest part? At dinner that week, my mother complimented me. "You've been so supportive," she said gently. "It means a lot to your brother." I looked at her and realized something heartbreaking. Support and silence had become indistinguishable to them. And what they never noticed was this. I was no longer supporting him. I was building the case that would protect me. Not loudly, not angrily, but completely. The line had already been crossed. I was simply deciding how to respond. The leverage didn't come with fireworks. It came with a PDF. 3 weeks after my meeting with the attorney, another envelope arrived, this time from the State Revenue Department. Not a penalty, not a demand, a notice of discrepancy. Reported income did not align with estimated tax filings. It was mild, procedural, a request for clarification. But to me, it was confirmation. The system had noticed. And the system doesn't care about sibling dynamics. I logged into the IRS portal again and pulled the updated transcript. The business revenue had increased again. Still no estimated payments. Still no proper separation between personal and business liability. I sat at my dining table with the documents spread out in front of me, rain tapping softly against the window again. Portland, steady and gray. For months I had been reacting emotionally, hurt, confused, disappointed. In that moment, I felt none of those things. I felt clarity. Daniel wasn't just temporarily using my name. He was operating a growing business under it while neglecting basic tax compliance. And because I had documented every objection, every request, every incomplete response, I now had something powerful. Proof of non-consent. That was the leverage. Not anger, not a threat, not a dramatic reveal. Documentation. I drafted the certified letter. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't accusatory. It stated, I had not authorized the continued use of my personal identifying information for business operations. I had requested correction verbally on multiple dates. I required immediate removal of my name from all business accounts and filings. If not resolved within a specified time frame, I would take formal steps to protect my identity. I read it 3 times. No insults, no blame language, just boundary. I mailed it certified. I didn't text him to warn him. I didn't call. I allowed the mail carrier to become the messenger. 2 days later, he called. His voice wasn't angry, it was confused. Why are you making this so official? I stayed calm. Because it is official. It's just family. No, I replied evenly. It's tax reporting. There was a pause. You're acting like I did something criminal? I didn't answer that directly. I'm acting like my identity is legally attached to something I don't control. Silence. For the first time, I heard something unfamiliar in his tone. Not arrogance. Not charm. Unease. He asked for time again. I gave him a deadline. 30 days. Not as a threat. As a process. That was the private reveal. He finally understood that my silence had not been a surrender. It had been an assessment. And here's what shifted inside me in that moment. I no longer needed him to admit wrongdoing. I no longer needed my parents to validate my discomfort. The documentation validated me. There's something deeply stabilizing about evidence. It removes the need for emotional persuasion. He could argue feelings. He couldn't argue with filings. Over the next week, I monitored everything closely. No immediate changes. Revenue continued flowing. No estimated tax payments made. The deadline approached. And I realized something important. Even if he corrected it now, the exposure had already occurred. Back taxes would still be attributed to me unless formally disputed. Liability had already accumulated. That was the final piece of clarity. This wasn't just about stopping him. It was about correcting the record. And correction requires formal action. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. Family loyalty ends where identity theft begins. I had given him space to choose accountability. If he didn't, I would choose protection. Quietly, completely, irreversibly. The deadline came and went. No transfer of ownership. No dissolution paperwork. No confirmation from the bank. Daniel sent a message the night before the 30 days expired. I'm working on it. These things take time. That was all. No documentation attached. No formal updates. Just reassurance wrapped in vagueness. For a few hours, I sat with it. There's a moment before an irreversible decision where your body tries to bargain with you. It offers softer alternatives. It whispers about repair, about optics, about how this will fracture things permanently. I made tea. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call anyone. I laid out my options on paper the way I would for a client. Option 1, continue waiting, extend the deadline. Hope compliance improves organically. Risk, continued tax liability. Escalating penalties, potential credit exposure, implied consent. Option 2, privately hire a CPA to untangle everything quietly while allowing Daniel to operate. Risk, financial cost to me. Continued use of my identity. No behavioral correction. Option 3, file an identity theft affidavit with the IRS and formally report unauthorized use. Risk, investigation, family fallout. Irreversible damage to trust. I stared at the third option for a long time. People imagine that reporting family feels explosive. It doesn't. It feels heavy, dense. Like stepping onto a bridge you know will not let you turn back. I asked myself one final question. If this were not my brother, what would I advise? The answer was immediate. Document, report, protect. Intent doesn't change liability, and family status doesn't change federal reporting requirements. The quiet truth was this. He had already made his decision. Every time he ignored my request. Every time he delayed formal correction. Every time revenue increased without proper tax allocation. He chose continuation, which meant my choice wasn't the first irreversible act. It was the response to one. I opened the IRS website and began the identity theft process. The form required specifics. Dates, account numbers, and evidence of non-consent. I had all of it. Organized, indexed, ready. As I typed, I didn't feel rage. I felt alignment. This was not revenge. Revenge seeks emotional satisfaction. This sought legal clarity. I also contacted the bank where the business account was held and filed a formal dispute of unauthorized account usage tied to my personal information. The representative asked, "Is this someone you know?" "Yes," I said calmly, "but that's not relevant." There was a pause on the line. "You're right," she replied. When I hung up, my house felt unusually still. I understood something then. People often believe the loudest moment is the most powerful one. It isn't. The most powerful moment is the quiet one where you choose not to protect someone from the consequences of their own decisions. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't announce what I had done. There was no dramatic text message. I simply submitted the documentation and closed my laptop. The process would take time. Reviews, investigations, requests for additional information. But the mechanism had been activated. And mechanisms, once activated, don't bend for family dinners. I sat by the window and watched the rain for a while. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't crying. I was steady. For the first time since that first thin envelope arrived, my name felt like it belonged to me again. Because I had acted in its defense. Not loudly, but decisively. The bridge had been crossed, and there was no going back. After I filed the affidavit and reported the unauthorized use, nothing happened. At least nothing visible. That's the unsettling part about formal systems. They don't move with dramatic soundtracks. They move in processing queues, in internal flags, in quiet reviews that unfold behind screens you'll never see. Daniel continued texting about contracts. "Just landed another client. Thinking about expanding to Nevada. Cash flow's finally stabilizing." I responded less and less. Noted. "Please send documentation. Consult your accountant." He assumed I was being distant. He had no idea I had already stepped outside the structure entirely. Within a week, I received confirmation that my identity theft claim had been logged. The letter was procedural, unemotional. It outlined the next steps: review period, potential correspondence, and possible audit triggers. Good. Let the system look. I also froze my credit entirely, not just placed alerts. A full freeze. If Daniel attempted to open a line of credit, it would stall immediately. I didn't warn him. Protection doesn't require permission. At Sunday dinner, everything appeared normal. My mother asked about work. My father discussed rising property taxes. Daniel talked about scaling revenue projections. I observed him differently now. Not like my brother with big ideas, but as a business operator who had assumed informal access to someone else's legal identity. The shift in perception was subtle but permanent. He mentioned applying for a small loan to smooth expansion. I sipped my water and said nothing. Inside, I knew any application tied to my name would now trigger scrutiny. 2 weeks later, the first ripple surfaced. Daniel texted late at night. "Did you freeze your credit?" There it was. I waited before responding. "Yes." "Why?" "For my protection." "You didn't tell me." "I didn't need to." Silence. He didn't accuse me directly. He didn't admit intent. But the tension in his short replies told me everything. A day later, he called. "The bank flagged something. They're asking questions about ownership documentation." "That makes sense," I replied evenly. "Why would it make sense?" "Because I formally disputed the account." The pause on the line felt longer than any we'd shared before. "You what?" "I disputed the unauthorized use of my identity." His breathing shifted. Not yelling. Not yet. Just destabilized. "You're overreacting." "No," I said calmly, and I'm correcting the record. There was frustration in his voice now. "You could have talked to me." "I did, multiple times." Another silence. Systems are patient. They don't argue. They verify. Over the next week, he sent shorter messages. Less confidence. More urgency. They're asking for additional documentation. They want proof of authorization. They're reviewing prior filings. I didn't celebrate. This wasn't about watching him struggle. It was about watching structure replace assumption. I forwarded no emotional commentary. I didn't gloat. I didn't lecture. I simply maintained the same tone. I require written confirmation of removal. At dinner that Sunday, he was quieter. My parents noticed but didn't understand. Something was shifting under the surface, and only he and I knew why. That's the power of moving in silence. No public humiliation, no dramatic announcement. Just consequences are activated through proper channels. For the first time, he was experiencing what I had been carrying for months. Uncertainty tied to documentation, exposure tied to action, and I remained composed, because this was never about punishing him. It was about ensuring my name was no longer collateral. The mechanisms were in motion now, and mechanisms don't negotiate over family loyalty. They evaluate compliance, quietly, relentlessly. The first visible consequence didn't look dramatic. It looked like an inconvenience. Daniel called 3 days after our last conversation. His voice was tighter than usual, not angry, not explosive, constrained. The bank temporarily restricted the account, he said. They're reviewing ownership documentation. Payments are delayed. I didn't respond immediately. I see, I said finally. You didn't have to escalate it like this. I asked for removal. It wasn't done. There was a long exhale on the other end. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Harder. That word lingered with me, because what he meant was, you're no longer absorbing the friction. Within a week, the ripple spread. A vendor contacted him, asking why a transfer hadn't cleared. Payroll processing flagged discrepancies tied to verification. The State Revenue Department sent a second notice, this time more formal, requesting clarification on reported income under my Social Security number. He forwarded the notice to me with one line. What did you do? I didn't answer that question directly. I corrected my exposure. The difference in our language was subtle but significant. He framed it as a disruption. I framed it as protection. At Sunday dinner, the shift was visible. Daniel wasn't animated. He wasn't pitching expansion. He was quieter, more distracted. My mother asked if everything was okay with the business. Just admin issues, he said dismissively. Admin issues. I held my fork steadily and didn't comment. For the first time in months, he didn't reference the company as ours. He referred to it as the account. The ownership illusion was dissolving. 2 days later, I received official correspondence from the IRS acknowledging receipt of my identity theft affidavit and opening a case for review. They would be contacting all parties listed on the associated filings. All parties. That meant him. I didn't forward the letter. I didn't warn him. Systems don't send courtesy alerts. They send notices. That week, Daniel's messages shifted in tone. This is getting serious. They're asking for proof you authorized this. We can fix this internally. You don't need them involved. There it was. Not an apology. Containment. He wasn't worried about fairness. He was worried about the investigation. I responded once clearly. I gave you 30 days to correct it. This is the result of inaction. He didn't reply for several hours. When he finally did, it was the first message that sounded close to vulnerability. I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. That sentence told me everything. He believed my restraint was permanent. He believed my loyalty was unconditional. He believed my boundaries were theoretical. The consequences weren't loud. No agents at the door. No dramatic seizures of assets. Just review. Just scrutiny. Just documentation replacing assumption. And that is often more destabilizing than spectacle. At dinner the following Sunday, my father mentioned receiving a confusing letter about the business address. He looked puzzled. Daniel brushed it off. Clerical stuff. I watched him carefully. For the first time, he looked uncertain, not because I had attacked him, but because the system was asking the same questions I had been asking for months. Proof of authorization, proper tax allocation, ownership verification. The structure he had casually built under my name was now under formal review, and there was nothing I needed to do except remain consistent. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt balanced. The weight I had been carrying alone was now distributed across official channels. Consequences don't always feel explosive. Sometimes they feel like gravity finally asserting itself. Quiet, inevitable, precise. And this was only the beginning. The shift from inconvenience to panic happened gradually. At first, Daniel treated the inquiries like obstacles. Annoying, but manageable. He told our parents it was a routine audit trigger. He reassured vendors. He reassured himself. But systems don't respond to reassurance. They respond to documentation. 2 weeks into the review, he called me late in the evening. His voice was different. Not defensive, not irritated, unsteady. They're asking for original authorization forms, he said. Signed, dated. I let the silence sit for a moment. There aren't any, I replied calmly. I know that, he snapped, then softened. I mean, we can draft something. You could sign retroactively, just to show consent. Retroactively. The word landed heavily. No, I said. You're really going to let this escalate? I'm not escalating it. You reported it. Yes. Another long pause. You're my sister, and this is my identity. That was the first time I said it that plainly. He exhaled sharply. You don't understand how bad this could get. I did understand. Back taxes, penalties, potential misrepresentation, financial exposure. What he meant was, you don't understand how bad this could get for me. The following week, the business account remained restricted. Clients began asking for clarity on delays. A payroll service requested ownership verification before releasing funds. Pressure compounds quickly when structures aren't legitimate. He sent a message that surprised me. I'll dissolve it. I'll shut everything down. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. There it was again. Containment. I read the message 3 times. If I withdrew the affidavit now, the filings would still exist. The discrepancies would remain on record. The income would still be tied to my social security number unless formally corrected. Silence at this stage would not undo exposure. It would validate it. I can't retract documentation that's already under review. I wrote back. You need to respond to their inquiries directly. You're destroying this, he replied. No, he had built it on borrowed ground. At Sunday dinner, the tension was no longer subtle. My mother sensed it. She asked why Daniel seemed stressed. He avoided specifics. My father mentioned hearing from a business acquaintance about compliance flags. Daniel's frustration surfaced quietly. This wouldn't be happening if people didn't overreact, he muttered. I didn't engage, because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about finishing a process. A few days later, he showed up at my townhouse unannounced. Not angry, not shouting, just tired. He sat across from me at my dining table, the same place where I had first assembled the documents months earlier. I didn't think it would spiral like this, he admitted. It didn't spiral, I said gently. It accumulated. He rubbed his face with both hands. I was going to fix it once revenue stabilized. That's not how liability works. Silence. For the first time, he looked at me not as infrastructure, but as authority. They're talking about penalties, he said quietly. They want amended returns. That's the consequence of operating under the wrong name. He stared at the table. Can we still fix this? I chose my words carefully. You can correct your filings, but you can't undo the fact that my identity was used without authorization. The room felt still. There was no screaming, no dramatic collapse, just a realization. The door that had quietly closed weeks ago was now visible to him. Too late to smooth it over. Too late to call it a misunderstanding. Too late to rely on my silence. This wasn't punishment. It was a correction. And correction, once initiated, doesn't reverse because discomfort sets in. He left that evening without raising his voice. And for the first time, I sensed he understood something fundamental. Family loyalty does not override federal law, and my patience was never permitted. The process would continue, with or without his approval, because some lines once crossed redraw the relationship permanently, not in anger, but in clarity. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in my parents' dining room, under soft yellow lighting, with untouched tea growing cold between us. By then, amended returns had been requested. The bank account had been formally closed pending review. Daniel was working with a CPA, one he should have hired from the beginning. Penalties were being calculated, installment plans discussed. Nothing catastrophic, but nothing is reversible. My parents had finally learned enough to understand that something serious had occurred. Not the full legal language, but enough to grasp that my name had been involved in ways it shouldn't have been. They asked us both to come over, not to argue, to clear the air. Daniel sat across from me, quieter than I'd ever seen him. No grand gestures, no persuasive tone, just fatigue. My mother spoke first. Why didn't you two handle this privately? I answered carefully. I tried. Daniel didn't contradict me. That mattered. My father looked between us. It's family. There must have been another way. I met his eyes. If someone used your social security number without asking, what would you do? He hesitated. That's different. It isn't, I said gently. No sharpness, no raised voice. Just a fact. Daniel finally spoke. I didn't think it was a big deal at first. I thought she'd understand. I nodded once. I did understand. That's why I gave you time. The room felt heavy but calm. There was no yelling, no accusations thrown like knives. Just a slow unraveling of assumptions. I wasn't trying to hurt you, he said quietly. I know, I replied. That was the truth. Intent doesn't change liability, but acknowledging intent changes tone. My mother looked at me. Reporting it, that was extreme. I held her gaze steadily. No, I said. Ignoring it would have been extreme. Silence settled again. I wasn't there to humiliate him. I wasn't there to make him confess wrongdoing in front of our parents. The systems were already handling consequences. I was there to establish something that had never been clearly stated in our family. My boundaries are not negotiable. Daniel exhaled slowly. I should have transferred it when you asked. Yes, no lecture, no elaboration. He looked at me differently then, not as infrastructure, not as an administrative backup, but as someone who had acted calmly, formally, decisively. I didn't think you'd actually go that far, he admitted again. I didn't either, I said honestly. That surprised him, because the truth was this wasn't comfortable for me. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't triumphant. It was necessary. My father finally spoke, quieter than before. So what happens now? Now, I said, he corrects his filings. The authorities finish their review, and my name is no longer attached. Simple, clear, done. No dramatic finale. No shattered relationships in that moment. Just recalibration. Daniel didn't apologize in a grand way. He didn't deliver a rehearsed statement of regret. But before we left, he said something that carried more weight than an apology would have. I won't involve you in my business again. That was enough. Not because I feared involvement, but because he now understood that involvement requires consent. The confrontation ended not with anger, but with quiet recognition. I hadn't raised my voice once throughout the entire process, and yet something fundamental had shifted. Not just legally, relationally. For the first time in our adult lives, I wasn't the reliable safety net. I was in line, and everyone in that room could see it. It's been over a year since the review closed. The penalties were assessed. Payment plans were arranged. The amended returns were filed correctly, under Daniel's own business entity, properly registered this time. My name was removed from every document it never should have been on. The systems finished their work, and so did I. People sometimes ask, carefully, indirectly, if I regret reporting it. They expect hesitation. There isn't any. What I feel isn't satisfaction. It isn't vindication. It isn't even relief in the dramatic sense. It's alignment. For most of my life, I was the reliable one, the calm one, the one who made things smoother for everyone else. That identity wasn't false, it just wasn't complete. What changed wasn't my temperament, it was my hierarchy. I no longer rank family harmony above self-respect. That doesn't mean I love my brother less. It means I love myself enough to draw lines. Daniel and I still speak. Our conversations are different now, less performative, less casual when it comes to money. If he mentions a new venture, he does so carefully, independently. There's distance, not hostility, distance built from clarity. My parents eventually stopped framing the situation as an overreaction. They saw the documentation. They saw the letters. They saw the consequences unfold in a way that couldn't be smoothed over with sentiment. Something subtle shifted in how they speak to me, too. They ask for my advice differently, not because I'm the dependable one, but because they recognize that my calm isn't passivity. It's discernment. The most unexpected change happened internally. Before all of this, I equated silence with maturity. I believed that absorbing discomfort preserved connection. Now I understand something deeper. Silence can be wisdom, but it can also be self-erasure. The difference is intention. When I stayed quiet before, I was protecting everyone else from tension. When I moved quietly later, I was protecting myself with a strategy. Same volume, different purpose. I still keep my black leather portfolio. It's fuller now, not with fear, but with precedent. A reminder that documentation is not cold. It's clarity, and clarity is not cruelty. It's self-respect. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Boundaries don't have to be loud to be immovable. You don't have to humiliate someone to correct them. You don't have to scream to be taken seriously. You just have to act in alignment with your own standards, consistently. Family loyalty is powerful, but it is not infinite. It ends where identity theft begins, and choosing that boundary didn't make me colder. It made me whole. I'm still calm, still measured, still quiet. But now when I enter a room, I don't shrink my authority to preserve comfort. I carry it openly, not as a weapon, as a fact. I'm no longer infrastructure. I'm ownership of my name, of my choices, of myself, and that is who I am now. When people hear this story, they often focus on the reporting, on the affidavit, on the investigation, on the fallout. But that was never the core of it. The core was this. For years, I believed that being the reliable one meant absorbing discomfort quietly. I believed that loyalty meant flexibility, that love meant giving the benefit of the doubt indefinitely. What I learned, slowly, painfully, precisely, is that loyalty without boundaries becomes complicity. And complicity has consequences. I didn't report my brother because I hated him. I reported the misuse of my identity because I respected myself. There's a difference. It's easy to imagine justice as loud, explosive, emotional, a dramatic confrontation that leaves everyone stunned. But sometimes justice is administrative. Its forms are filled out carefully, its deadlines honored, its documentation was submitted without theatrics. It's the quiet refusal to carry someone else's liability. Family loyalty ends where identity theft begins. That line isn't cruel. It's necessary. If you've ever been the stable one, the easy one, the one who smooths things over because you're strong enough to handle it, ask yourself something gently. Are you being trusted or are you being used? There's no shame in loving your family. There's no shame in wanting peace. But peace that requires you to erase your own boundaries isn't peace. It's postponement. And postponement always collects interest. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where do you draw the line between loyalty and self-respect? Tell me in the comments. I'm listening.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.